What you're about to hear is the story of the 400 years the Bible never recorded. A time when the heavens fell silent, when no prophet rose, and no vision was given. In that silence, a king would dare to defile the house of God. A people would be pushed to the edge of extinction. And from the ashes of a desecrated temple, a rebellion would be born that history would never forget. This narrative is drawn from ancient Jewish writings, the books of the Maccabees, the histories of Josephus, and the chronicles of the Second Temple period, preserving the full weight of what truly happened between the final prophet and the coming of the Messiah. Prepare yourself to witness the silent centuries, told the way they were lived, sacred, brutal, and unlike anything your church has ever taught you. This is the 400 years of silence. Within 3 days, he had slaughtered 80,000 people, 40,000 cut down in hand-to-hand combat, and as many were sold into slavery as were killed, written more than 2,000 years ago by the ancient chronicler of the Maccabees. And every word is true. 3 days. That is all it took to break a nation. Men fell in the streets of David. Women perished in the doorways of their homes. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. The chosen people of God ran across the very stones where the prophets had once walked, and they did not return. And the man who ordered it called himself a god. His name was Antiochus IV, Greek king of the Seleucid Empire, ruler of the lands north of Israel. He stamped his coins with the title Theos Epiphanes, God made manifest. He demanded that every nation in his kingdom worship him as a living deity. And in the year 167 before Christ, he turned his eyes toward Jerusalem and decided that the God of the Jews must bow too. Years before the great attack on the city, Antiochus had already entered Jerusalem once. He had come not as a guest. He came as a thief. The ancient writings of the Maccabees remember it this way. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He stripped it all off, like a common thief. The golden altar, the 7-branched menorah that had burned for centuries, the table of the bread of the presence, the sacred vessels that Moses had commanded, that David had gathered, that Solomon had placed in their sanctuaries, torn from the walls, loaded onto wagons, carried away to a pagan king's treasury. But the plunder was only the warning. 2 years later, he would return, and this time he would not come for gold. He came under a flag of peace. He spoke peaceable words to the people of the city. He smiled at the priests. He promised mercy, and the moment the gates were opened, his army fell upon them. But the city was not the prize he had truly come for. The abomination on the altar. He turned his eyes to the temple itself, to the Holy of Holies, to the dwelling place of the Most High. And he committed the act that the prophet Daniel had foreseen more than 300 years before. In a vision given to him in the days of the Babylonian exile, Daniel had written, "His armed forces shall rise up to profane the temple. They shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." It was the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Chislev. The year was 167 before Christ. A statue of Zeus, the supreme god of the Greeks, was dragged into the sanctuary of the Lord and placed upon the altar of God. And on that same altar, where for 1,000 years only the blood of clean animals had been offered to the Most High, where the patriarchs had once offered lambs of atonement, where the priests had once kindled the fire of the covenant, the soldiers of Antiochus offered a pig, an unclean beast. sacrificed in the holiest place on earth, the decree that outlawed God. He sent letters to every village in Judea, to every household, to every Jewish soul in his kingdom. His decree was simple. His decree was final. To forbid burnt offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to build altars for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, so that they should forget the law. And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. The Sabbath outlawed, the festivals of the Lord outlawed, the reading of the Torah outlawed, the covenant of Abraham outlawed. But laws on paper are only ink. What came next was the enforcement. In the villages, the soldiers went from house to house. They found mothers who had dared to circumcise their newborn sons. The ancient chronicler simply records, "They put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. And those who hid the scrolls of the Torah in their homes, the books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant was condemned to death. The word of God and the keepers of the word are burned." For nearly 300 years, the people of Israel had waited for a word from God, a whisper, a sign, anything. But the heavens had given them nothing, not since the day the last prophet, a man named Malachi, had laid down his pen and closed his eyes forever. 300 years of silence, and now this. How did the God who once split the Red Sea, who once thundered from Mount Sinai, who once filled the temple with a glory so bright the priests could not stand? To understand how Israel reached this moment, we have to go back. Back more than 250 years before the day Antiochus walked into the temple. Back to a Jerusalem that still remembered the voice of God. The year is around 430 before Christ. The people of Israel have returned from exile in Babylon. The temple has been rebuilt, though it is smaller, poorer, less glorious than the one Solomon once raised. The walls of Jerusalem stand again, repaired by the hands of Nehemiah, and the people are weary. They had hoped that when they returned to the land of their fathers, the priests became careless, the offerings became corrupted, the covenant became routine, and into that fading world came one final prophet. His name was Malachi. The name itself means "my messenger." And what he said was the final word of God to his people for the next 400 years. Malachi stood in the courts of the temple. He looked upon the priests with their stained robes and their indifferent eyes. He looked upon the people who had grown cold and forgetful, and he opened his mouth, and the voice of the Lord came forth one last time. When you offer blind animals in sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you offer the lame or diseased, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? And then, at the very end of his prophecy, Malachi delivered the words that would not be answered for 400 years. The first promise was about a messenger. "See, I will send my messenger, who will prepare the way before me." Then, suddenly, the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. A messenger, one who would come to prepare the way for the Lord himself. The second promise was even greater. "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents." Elijah was the prophet who had called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, the prophet who had been taken up to the heavens in a chariot of flame, the one whose return would mean that the day of the Lord was at hand. And then the prophet himself was gone. But we know what came after. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, there was no prophet in Israel. The voice that had thundered from Mount Sinai had grown silent, and the people of Israel, the people who had been called the chosen of God, found themselves alone. The temple still stood, the priests still served. And then, from the west, came the storm. In the year 336 before Christ, a young man of 20 stood on the western edge of the known world and dreamed of conquering it. He was Greek. He came from a kingdom no one took seriously, and he was about to conquer nearly every nation between Greece and India. His name was Alexander, the son of King Philip of Macedon, a young man trained in war from the time he could hold a sword, and trained in philosophy by Aristotle himself. When his father died, Alexander inherited a small kingdom on the edge of Europe. 2 years later, he led his army across the sea and turned his eyes toward the greatest empire the world had ever seen: Persia, the empire that had once held Israel in exile, the empire that had stretched from the borders of India to the deserts of Egypt, the empire that had reigned for 200 years over the lands of the Jews, and in a series of battles that the ancient world could not believe, Alexander broke it. He shattered the Persian armies at Granicus. He shattered them again at Issus. He marched into Egypt and was crowned a pharaoh. He marched into Babylon and was crowned a king. And then he turned his armies toward Jerusalem. The story is preserved for us by the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, and it is one of the most extraordinary moments in the silent centuries. And he was coming. The high priest of Jerusalem at that time was a man named Jaddua. According to Josephus, Jaddua and the priests of the temple put on their sacred robes, the white linen, the blue and purple of the priesthood, the breastplate of 12 stones, and they walked out of the gates of Jerusalem directly into the path of Alexander's army. And then the unthinkable happened. When Alexander saw the high priest approaching, dressed in the robes of the Most High, he stopped. He dismounted from his horse. He walked toward the priest, and, in front of his entire army and generals, Alexander the Great bowed down to the high priest of Israel. His generals were horrified. One of them asked the king why he, who was worshipped as a god, would bow to a Jewish priest. Alexander answered that he had seen this very man in a dream long before his conquest began. The high priest in his robes had appeared to him in a vision and promised him victory over Persia. And so Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. He spared the city. He honored the temple. He offered sacrifices to the God of the Jews, and he granted the Jewish people the right to live by their own laws under his rule. Alexander pushed his armies all the way to the borders of India, and there, far from his home, far from the Greek mountains, he stopped. His men were exhausted. His generals were broken. His body was scarred with the wounds of 100 battles. He returned to the city of Babylon, and in the year 323 before Christ, at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great died. No one is certain how. Some ancient writers blamed fever, others whispered of poison. He left behind an empire, and no son to inherit it. Alexander had conquered the world, but he had built nothing to hold it together, so his generals tore it apart. 4 kingdoms rose from the ashes of his empire. 4 shattered fragments of the largest empire the world had ever seen. One of those fragments was the kingdom of Syria, ruled by a general named Seleucus, and from the line of Seleucus, 250 years later, would come the king who stamped his coins with the title God Made Manifest, the king who slaughtered 80,000 in 3 days. But before that king would rise, something extraordinary would happen that the people of Israel did not yet understand. In the city of Alexandria, a strange decision was made. The Greek ruler of Egypt at the time was a king named Ptolemy, and he commissioned a translation. He gathered 70 Jewish scholars from the land of Israel. He brought them to Egypt, and he asked them to take the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah of Moses, the Psalms of David, the prophecies of Isaiah, and translate them into Greek. The Hebrew tongue had been the language of God's people for over 1,000 years, but Greek was now the language of the world. The translation took years, and when it was finished, it was called the Septuagint, from the Latin word meaning 70, for the 70 scholars who completed it. For the first time in history, the Word of God could be read by every nation under heaven. The God who had fallen silent had been preparing the world for his arrival the entire time. But Israel did not see it, and from the north, a new king was rising. A king who would awaken every horror the silent centuries had been hiding. When Alexander died, his empire was torn into 4 kingdoms. 2 of them would matter to the Jewish people, and 2 of them would fight over the land of Israel for the next 150 years. To the south, in Egypt, sat the kingdom of the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that had commissioned the Septuagint, the dynasty that had ruled the Jews with relative mercy for 100 years. To the north, in Syria, sat the kingdom of the Seleucids, the descendants of Alexander's general Seleucus, a line of kings that grew more aggressive, more arrogant, and more dangerous with every generation. For decades, Israel was caught between them. The land of the Jews became a battlefield, fought over again and again by 2 Greek powers. And then, in the year 175 before Christ, the worst of all the Seleucid kings ascended the throne. His brother had been murdered. His enemies had been removed. The crown was his, and he gave himself a new name, Theos Epiphanes, God made manifest. The king the heavens had been waiting on had finally arrived, but his treasury was empty, his armies were expensive, his ambitions stretched from the borders of Egypt to the heart of Persia. He needed gold, and he knew exactly where to find it: in Jerusalem, in the temple of the Jews, in a treasury that, for over 300 years, had been filled with the offerings of every faithful Jew from every corner of the ancient world. Antiochus marched south, and in the first of his sins against the Most High, he stripped the house of God of every sacred object he could carry. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He stripped it all off. The temple was wounded. The treasury was emptied. The king returned to Syria a wealthier man. But the Jews were not finished resisting, and Antiochus was not finished punishing them. He had a plan no Persian king, no pharaoh of Egypt had ever dared to do. Antiochus believed something that no previous ruler of the Jewish people had believed. He believed that Judaism itself was the problem. But Antiochus looked at the Jewish people and saw something different. He saw a stubborn, rebellious nation that refused to bow to him as a god. And he made a decision. He would not just rule the Jewish people, he would erase them. There would be no more Jews, only Greeks who happened to live in the land of Judea. And to accomplish it, he would have to break the one thing the Jewish people held most sacred, the temple itself. And the soldiers of Antiochus carried it out with terrible precision. But there is one final story from those dark days, one story so painful, so cruel, that the ancient chroniclers wept as they wrote it. The book of the Maccabees tells of a Jewish mother and her 7 sons. The soldiers of Antiochus brought them before the king. They were ordered, one by one, to eat the unclean meat of a pig. a violation of the Torah, a denial of their God. The first son refused. He was tortured. He was put to death before his mother's eyes. Each one chose death rather than betray the God of Abraham. And after 6 of her sons had been killed before her, the mother turned to her 7th and youngest child. The boy looked at the king. He looked at the body of his last brother, and he refused. He too was put to death. And then, last of all, the mother followed her sons. 7 sons, 7 refusals, 7 martyrs of the silent centuries. And in the village of Modine, an old priest was about to hear the news, and he was about to say a word that would change everything. The village was called Modine. It sat in the hill country northwest of Jerusalem, a small, quiet place where the families of the priesthood had lived for generations. But on a certain day in the year 167 before Christ, a king's officer arrived in Modine, and he brought with him the decree of Antiochus. A pagan altar had been built in the center of the village. A pig had been brought, and every Jewish man in Modine was now ordered to step forward, one by one, and offer the unclean beast in sacrifice to the gods of Greece. In the front of the crowd stood an old priest. His name was Mattathias. The king's officer turned to Mattathias first. "You are a leader," he said. "You are honored in this village. Step forward, make the sacrifice, and the king will reward you with silver and gold." The old priest looked at the officer. Then he opened his mouth, and the ancient chronicler preserved his answer for us, word for word. "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." The officer pressed forward. He gave the order, and another Jewish man in the crowd, a man whose name the chroniclers refused to record, broke from the line. He walked toward the pagan altar. He prepared to make the sacrifice. Mattathias saw him. The book of the Maccabees describes what happened next in a single shattering line. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. And the old priest of Modine turned to the stunned crowd, and he cried out the words that would echo across the centuries. "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." That very day, Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the wilderness, and behind them, the rebellion began. But Mattathias was an old man. The fight that was coming would not be his to lead, but the body of the old priest was failing him. And so, in the year 166 before Christ, Mattathias called his 5 sons to his bedside. He looked upon them one last time, and he gave them a charge that the book of the Maccabees has preserved for us across 2,000 years. "My children, be courageous and grow strong in the law, for by it you will gain honor. Remember the deeds of our ancestors, which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name." And then the old priest pointed to his middle son, Judas. "From your youth he has been strong and mighty," said Mattathias. "He shall be your commander." Mattathias closed his eyes. The old priest of Modine was gone. The boy with the strange nickname would be known as one of the greatest warriors the Jewish people have ever known. The Jewish people called him Judah ha-Maccabee. The Seleucid Empire sent its first army against him. Judas attacked them in the mountain passes and shattered them. Antiochus sent a larger army led by his greatest generals, with elephants of war and Greek phalanxes that had broken nations. Judas defeated them in battle after battle. The hammer of Judah Maccabee struck the armies of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. And then, in the year 164 before Christ, he turned his eyes toward Jerusalem. Judas Maccabee and his army marched into the holy city. They climbed the steps of the Temple Mount. They walked through the courts where, 3 years before, the soldiers of Antiochus had carried away the golden altar and the menorah and the holy vessels. The book of the Maccabees describes it for us. They saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts, they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. The altar where a pig had once been offered still bore the marks of the unclean offering. Judas and his men tore down that altar. They built a new one, from unhewn stones, just as the law of Moses had commanded. They cleansed the sanctuary. They made new holy vessels, wove new curtains, and they prepared new oil for the lamps of the menorah. And on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Chislev, exactly 3 years to the day after Antiochus had defiled it, Judas Maccabee and the priests of Israel rekindled the lamps of the temple of the Most High. But there was a problem. There was only enough sacred oil for a single day. The lamps of the menorah were meant to burn continually. When Judas and the priests entered the temple to relight the menorah, they searched the ruined chambers for the holy oil, and after a long search, they found one small jar, a single jar of sacred oil, enough to burn for 1 day and no more. They lit the menorah anyway, and the lamps burned through the first night, and the second, and the third, for 8 days, the days it would take to prepare new sacred oil. That single jar continued to burn. And the family that had saved Israel was about to become the very thing they once fought against. The temple was cleansed. The lights of the menorah burned again, and for the first time in 3 years, the people of Israel were free. But freedom is a strange thing. It is easier to win in battle than to keep in peace. Judas the hammer would die on the battlefield only a few years after the rededication of the temple, struck down in a hopeless stand against another Seleucid army. His brother Jonathan took up the fight, and then he too was killed. His brother Simon took the throne, and then he too was murdered. But before Simon died, he named himself High Priest of Israel, and he named himself King of the Jews. The Maccabees had risen to save the priesthood. Now they were about to corrupt it. The dynasty they founded was called the Hasmoneans, named for an ancestor of Mattathias. And for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, a single family held both the throne and the priesthood at the same time. The ancient law of Moses had forbidden this. These were 2 separate offices, 2 separate callings, 2 separate covenants from God. But the Hasmoneans were of the priestly line. They were not of the royal line. And yet, they took the crown anyway. The sons of the Maccabees, the family that had once died for the Torah, were now breaking it. The grandchildren of Mattathias began to act like the very Greek kings their grandfather had risen up against. They wore Greek robes. They took Greek names. They built palaces in the Greek style. In the shadow of the Hasmonean court, 3 great factions began to form among the Jewish people. The first were called the Pharisees. They were the teachers of the common people, the scholars of the law, the men who believed that every Jew should keep the Torah faithfully in his daily life. The second were called the Sadducees. They were the aristocrats, the priestly class, the wealthy and powerful families who served in the temple and dominated the high priesthood. They rejected the resurrection. They rejected the angels. They held only to the written law of Moses. And the third was called the Essenes. They were the ones who had seen enough. They looked at the Hasmonean kings, priests who had crowned themselves rulers, men who had defiled the office of the high priesthood, and they declared the entire temple unclean and left Jerusalem. They wrote their own scriptures. They waited for the true Messiah to come and cleanse the temple a second time. 2,000 years later, in the year 1947 of the Christian era, a shepherd boy would stumble into a cave near the Dead Sea and discover their scrolls, perfectly preserved in clay jars. The world would call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, the voices of a forgotten community preserved through the silent centuries, speaking again at last. By the year 63 before Christ, almost exactly 100 years after the rededication of the temple, the Hasmonean family had fallen into civil war. Two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, fought each other for the throne, and each brother, desperate to win, made the same fatal decision. They appealed to a foreign power, a power that had been rising in the West for centuries by methodically devouring every kingdom in its path. Rome. The Roman general at that time was a man named Pompey the Great. He listened to both brothers, he weighed their offers, and then, like every Roman general before him, he saw a chance to plant the Roman flag in yet another corner of the world. He marched on Jerusalem and he laid siege to the city. And after 3 months of war, the soldiers of Rome broke the walls of the holy city. But Pompey was not finished. He wanted to see what the Jews had been hiding for 1,000 years. Pompey marched up the steps of the Temple Mount. His soldiers cut down the priests who tried to stop him. The chronicles say that the priests of the temple continued to offer the daily sacrifices even as the Roman swords fell upon them, refusing to abandon their service to God even in death. Pompey walked through the courts. He passed the altar. He passed the holy place. And then, slowly, he pushed aside the veil that had hidden the Holy of Holies for centuries. He walked into the most sacred chamber in the entire Jewish world, the room where, on one day each year, only the high priest of Israel was permitted to enter, the room where the presence of God himself was said to dwell. He left the temple alive. He did not destroy it. He did not plunder it, but the damage was done. The eagle of Rome had now planted itself on the holiest mountain on earth, and it would not leave for the next 700 years. But the worst was still to come, for Rome would soon raise up a new king over the Jews, a king who would build the most magnificent temple in history and slaughter children in the streets to keep his throne. Rome did not trust the Hasmonean family any longer. They needed a different kind of king, a king who would be loyal to Rome above all else, a king who would do whatever the Romans asked and ask no questions. They found him a man named Herod. He was not a Jew by blood. He was an Edomite, but Rome named him King of the Jews. And in the year 37 before Christ, Herod entered Jerusalem at the head of a Roman army, killed the last of the Hasmonean royal family, and took the throne. The temple of Herod, the temple where in just a few short years a young rabbi from Galilee would walk, and in the corners of his kingdom a whisper was growing louder, a whisper the silent centuries had been waiting for since the days of Malachi. 400 years since the prophet Malachi laid down his pen. 400 years since the heavens last spoke to the people of God. 4 empires had risen and fallen in that time: Persia, Greece, the Seleucids of Syria, the Romans of the West, A pagan king had defiled the holy temple. A faithful family had risen to save it. Their grandchildren had betrayed everything they died for. The people of God were waiting. For 4 centuries, no prophet had risen in Israel. No voice from heaven had thundered from the temple. No vision had been given to the priests at the altar. The silence had become so deep, so long, that an entire generation had begun to believe that God had simply forgotten them. But God, He had been working in the silence the whole time. Look back now at the 400 years. The Greek language, once forced upon the Jews by Alexander's conquerors, was now spoken in every corner of the known world, from the deserts of Egypt to the shores of Italy, from the islands of the Aegean to the mountains of Asia Minor. The Septuagint, the Hebrew scriptures, translated by 70 scholars in the city of Alexandria, was now read in synagogues all the way from Babylon to Rome. The prophecies of Isaiah, the Psalms of David, the promises of the Messiah already translated, the Roman roads built by the iron legions of the empire that had conquered Israel, now stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. Roads that one day soon 12 men from the hills of Galilee would walk. The synagogues, born in the dark days of the silent centuries when the temple was far away or defiled, now stood in every Jewish village from Spain to Persia. Places of teaching, places of prayer, and the Jewish people themselves scattered across the empire by centuries of war and exile, waiting for the Messiah, for the one who would deliver them, and the voice that had been silent since the days of Malachi. On a certain day, in the 18th year of the reign of Herod the Great, a single old man walked into the temple of Jerusalem. His name was Zechariah. He was a priest of the order of Abijah. He had served at the altar of the Most High for most of his life. He was old now. His wife Elizabeth was also old, and they had never been able to have a child. On this day, by the casting of lots, as the law of Moses commanded, Zechariah had been chosen to enter the holy place of the temple and burn incense before the Lord. He walked into the holy place alone. The crowd of worshippers waited outside in the court. He prepared the incense. He approached the golden altar, and then he saw something. Standing beside the altar, on the right side, was an angel. Zechariah fell back in terror. He had served in the temple for 50 years, and in all that time, no angel had ever appeared. The voice of the messenger broke the silence. "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. He will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah." In the spirit and power of Elijah. The old prophecy of Malachi, the final words of the last prophet before the silence began, was coming to pass. "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." The messenger had come, the one who would prepare the way, and 400 years of silence was over. 6 months later, in a village no empire bothered to remember, a young woman was alone in her home. Her name was Mary. She was barely more than a girl. She was engaged to a man named Joseph. She was not yet his wife, and she had never known any man. And then the same messenger came to her. His name was Gabriel. His words to her, preserved for us across 2,000 years, were these: "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you. Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High." The young girl trembled. The angel waited. and from her lips came the words that would echo through eternity. Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. The silence had not just been broken, but it had been answered. For 400 years, the heavens had been quiet. The people of God had waited. But God had never been absent. He had been preparing the road. He had been raising the language. He had been gathering the people. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to send the message the world had been waiting for since the Garden of Eden. A Messiah, the Word, made flesh. The silence had broken. 400 years. That is how long the people of God waited in the dark. 400 years without a prophet, a vision. 400 years of empires marching across their land, of foreign kings defiling their temple, of mothers buried with their infants, of brothers crucified for refusing to bow. For 400 years, he had been preparing, and when the time was right, when every road had been laid, every language had been raised, the silence ended with a whisper in an old priest standing alone in the temple, in a young girl alone in her home in Nazareth. The lesson of the silent centuries is this: the silence of God is not the absence of God. When the heavens are quiet, He is not gone. He is working. May the God who works in the silence walk with you. Amen.